She handed it to me on a Thursday evening in October, right after dinner, while I was still at the table with the newspaper. A single index card, not a full page, but typed on her laptop and printed small enough to fit in her palm, which told me she had drafted it more than once before deciding on this final compact version. She set it down next to my coffee cup without a word first, just watching my face, the way you watch someone opening a gift you already know they won't like. Then she said, "Robert and I talked, and we think it's time we set up some ground rules for the house. Nothing dramatic, just structure." I picked up the card. It had a header in bold, "Household Expectations." 6 items, numbered. Quiet hours after 8 p.m. Shared grocery costs, itemized weekly, with a specific number attached to my portion. The garage was to be used for shared storage, which I understood meant my late wife's canning equipment, and my tools would need to make room for her exercise bike and Robert's kayak. Guests required 48 hours notice. The thermostat was to stay at 68 regardless of season. And the last item, the one she'd clearly saved for the bottom because she knew it would land hardest. Some financial planning conversations may need to happen soon, given long-term considerations. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't reacting to a feeling instead of to the words actually printed there. In my own house, the house I built the frame of with my own hands over 2 summers in 1979 and 1980, the house where Doris and I raised 3 kids and buried 2 dogs under the pecan tree, and where my name has been the only name on the deed since the county recorded it 46 years ago and hadn't picked up a second name since, a fact I'd confirmed personally 3 weeks earlier at the Hamilton County Records Office for reasons that had nothing to do with this card and everything to do with what was coming. I set the card down. I folded my hands on top of the newspaper. She was standing there with the posture of a woman bracing for an argument, maybe even hoping for one, because an argument would have given her something to push back against. What she got instead was me saying, "Before we talk about any of this, would you mind stepping out to the mailbox? I believe something came for me today." She blinked. She said, "Now?" I said, "Now's fine." She looked at the card on the table, then at me, then walked to the front door with the particular stiffness of someone who senses the ground has shifted under her but can't yet say how. I heard the storm door. I heard the mailbox lid. I heard about 4 seconds of nothing. And then I heard the specific tearing sound of certified mail, which rips different than a regular envelope because the paper's heavier and the seal's tighter. Then more nothing. Then the storm door again. She came back into the kitchen, a different woman than the one who'd left it. "My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 71 years old, and I live on Comstock Road outside Hendersonville, Tennessee, in the house I built before either of my daughters or my son were born. And what my daughter-in-law didn't know when she typed up her household expectations and slid them across my own kitchen table was that I had gone to a lawyer 5 weeks earlier, and that the certified letter waiting in that mailbox had been sitting there since the previous afternoon, prepared by my attorney 19 days before that, delivered by the postal carrier the day before she ever printed that card. She'd handed me her rules. I'd sent her to go get my answer. All right. Before we get into the rest of it, if you're watching this from somewhere warm tonight or somewhere cold, drop your town in the comments. I read every one of them. Now let me back this up to where it actually starts. I spent 34 years as a machinist, and then a shop foreman at a manufacturing plant outside Nashville that made precision components for HVAC systems, the kind of work where 1/1000th of an inch off means the whole part gets scrapped and somebody's name gets attached to why. I started on the floor at 19 and I finished running 2 shifts of 40 men at 63. And in between I learned the one lesson that machine work teaches everybody who stays in it long enough, which is that a piece either holds tolerance or it doesn't, and there's no version of close enough that a bearing housing respects. You measure twice, you cut once, and if the part's wrong, you don't argue with the measurement, you throw the part away and start again. That habit of mine doesn't stay in the shop. It comes home with you. It sits at your kitchen table with you for the rest of your life. I retired in 2016 with a pension and a good handshake from men I'd trained who were better than me by the time I left, which is exactly how it should go. And I figured the next chapter of my life was going to be about the house and the garden and Doris. Doris Ann Whitfield, maiden name Doris Ann Pruitt, born in 1954 in a hollow outside Cookville, was my wife for 44 years. And she had a gift I never had, which was that she could sit across from somebody at a church potluck for 10 minutes and tell you things about their marriage they hadn't told their own sister. She wasn't a gossip. She was a reader. She read people the way I read blueprints, and she was almost never wrong. And when she was wrong, it was because she'd given somebody more benefit of the doubt than they'd earned. She kept a garden along the east fence that she'd worked on every spring since 1985. Tomatoes and squash and a row of dahlias she was proud of. And she kept a set of notebooks in the hall closet, one for the garden, one for the household accounts, and one she never gave a name to but that I found after she passed, full of dates and short observations about people in the family, things she'd noticed and hadn't yet decided what to do with. I found 11 entries in that unnamed notebook from 2019 about Robert and Jennifer. She hadn't shown them to me. Not because she was keeping something from me, but because, like she used to say about a green tomato, it wasn't ripe yet, meaning the pattern hadn't finished showing itself to her, and she wasn't going to hand me half a conclusion. She died in March of 2022. An aneurysm, the doctor called it, which is a word that means there was no lead-up and no chance to say the things people think they'll get the chance to say. She was 68. She'd been up early that morning working in the garden in the cool part of the day, same as she'd done for 30-some years, and by that evening she was gone. And the house that had been ours in the particular way. A house belongs to two people who've spent 4 decades inside. It became mine. In the way things become yours, when the person you built the life with isn't there to share the ownership of it anymore, which is to say, completely, and also wrong, both at once. I haven't moved her reading chair from where it sits by the window. I haven't touched the pantry shelving she reorganized in 2017 after she said, out loud, to nobody in particular, there. Now that's finally right. I've kept up her garden along the east fence using her notebook as my instruction manual. And I'll tell you plainly, a man who never planted a dahlia bulb in his life can follow her handwriting well enough to get results that would make her nod. We had 3 children. Denise is 45, lives 2 hours away in Knoxville, works as a pharmacist, and calls me every single Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, a habit she started the month after her mother died, and never once broke. My youngest, Marcy, is out in Colorado and calls less because the time zones make it awkward, but she flies in twice a year and stays a week each time, and doesn't need an occasion to do it. And then there's Robert. Robert is 43. Robert has spent the better part of 20 years finding new and more elaborate ways to almost succeed at something. He sold insurance for 6 years and called leaving it a repositioning. He ran a lawn care franchise for 3 years that folded when he stopped paying the franchise fees on time, which he described to me as the franchise model not fitting his vision. He was never lazy, exactly. I want to be fair about that, because fairness matters to me, and it mattered to Doris. He worked plenty of hours. He just never worked them in a direction that built anything that lasted, which for a man who spent his life making parts that had to hold tolerance for 20 years is close to unforgivable, though I tried not to let him feel that from me, at least not out loud. Robert married Jennifer in 2017. Jennifer is 40, and she manages billing operations for a regional dental group. And she is, I want to be precise here, extremely good at her job, organized in a way that would have made a fine machinist if she'd gone into that instead. She has a way of looking at a room, or a relationship, or a family gathering, and seeing it primarily as a set of resources that are either being used efficiently or being wasted. That's not a cruelty. It's closer to a temperament. But I noticed inside the first year of the marriage that when Jennifer looked at my house, she wasn't seeing my house. She was seeing an underutilized asset. They moved in with me in the spring of 2022, 6 weeks after Doris's funeral. Robert had been between ventures again, this time something to do with reselling restaurant equipment that hadn't gotten off the ground, and there'd been an issue with their apartment lease in Nashville that he described as a landlord dispute, and that I didn't press on, because pressing would have required me to actually absorb the details, and I wasn't in a place yet to absorb much of anything. I offered the 2 spare bedrooms upstairs. It was a generous offer, the kind of offer a man makes when the house has gone quiet in a way he can't stand yet, and having people moving around upstairs, even people with their own agenda, was less lonesome than the alternative. That calculation held for a while. It didn't hold forever. The shift happened the way these things happen, which is not all at once, but as an accumulation, small enough in each individual moment, that objecting to any one of them would have made me the unreasonable one. End quote. In June of 2022, 2 months after they'd moved in, Jennifer reorganized the kitchen while I was at Denise's place in Knoxville for the weekend. Not dramatically. Practically. The coffee maker moved off the counter where Doris had kept it since 2003 because the new spot was nearer the outlet. The good knives got relocated to a drawer, Jennifer said, made more sense, workflow-wise. I put the coffee maker back the following Monday. Jennifer didn't say anything about it. Neither did I. In September, at dinner, Jennifer mentioned that the living room furniture wasn't arranged efficiently for how the space actually got used, and that she had some thoughts about repositioning things. That living room was arranged exactly the way Doris had said it in 2018, after we'd had it repainted, and Doris had used those same words about it that she'd used about the pantry. Finally right. I told Jennifer the room was fine as it was. She said, "Of course, just an idea." The idea didn't come up again in conversation, but it came up in the glances, the way she'd stand in the doorway of that room some evenings and look at the couch angle like it had personally wronged her. In November, Robert brought up, over coffee, how I was thinking about the long-term picture for the house. Not the house specifically, he said, just the practicality, in general terms, of one man rattling around in 4 bedrooms. He mentioned a retirement community out past Gallatin that a coworker's mother had moved into, said it had a pool and a full activity calendar, and seemed like it had really turned things around for her. He said he just wanted to plant the idea, no pressure. I told him I was comfortable right where I was. He said, "Of course, just raising it." I wrote both of those conversations down in a spiral notebook I'd started keeping that October. The same month, as it happens, that I decided what I was watching had crossed over into something worth documenting the way I used to document a tolerance failure on the shop floor, dated and specific, because a dated record can't be argued with later by somebody who has an interest in arguing with it. That notebook ran to 30-some pages by the Thursday Jennifer handed me her index card. The thing that moved me from watching to acting happened on a Saturday afternoon in early September, about 6 weeks before the card. I'd gone into town for a part for the tiller and come back sooner than expected because the hardware store didn't have what I needed. I came in through the side door off the carport, the door that doesn't announce itself the way the front door does, and I found Robert in my den, sitting at my desk, in my chair. With the bottom drawer open, the drawer where I keep the deed, the mortgage payoff paperwork from 2009, the life insurance policy, and the folder with Doris's estate documents that Denise, Marcy, and I had gone through together the year before. He had his phone out and angled down at something in that folder, and the little shutter click sound went off right as I stepped into the doorway. I didn't say anything at first. I stood there for a second and let myself actually look at what I was looking at before I decided what to do about it. Which is exactly what you do on a shop floor when a part comes off the line wrong. You don't react to the first thing you see. You look at the whole failure before you write the report. Then I said his name, and he looked up, and I watched his face run through about 3 different expressions in under 2 seconds before it landed on something easy and warm, like he'd rehearsed the landing even if he hadn't rehearsed the fall. He said he'd been trying to find our old insurance agent's contact info because he had a question about umbrella coverage for his and Jennifer's car, and he hadn't wanted to bother me with something so small. I told him I'd handle the insurance questions myself, and that I'd rather he not go through my desk without asking first. He apologized, said he hadn't thought it was a big deal. I said, "Robert, what exactly were you taking a picture of just now?" He said he wasn't sure. He'd been looking at a lot of papers. I looked at him a while longer. He held the easy expression, the way a man holds a smile for a photograph he doesn't want to be in. I told him if he ever needed to know anything about this house, he could ask me directly, and then I told him to go on and get washed up for dinner. He left the den. I sat down at that desk for a long time afterward, thinking about what a person does with a photograph of a deed and a mortgage payoff letter and a stack of estate paperwork, and thinking about that retirement community out past Gallatin that he'd mentioned 2 months before with the pool and the activity calendar, and I heard Doris in my head, plain as anything, saying what she used to say about the families she worked with for 31 years as a caseworker for the county. You learn everything you need to know about a person, from what they do in the room they think is empty. I called my attorney that Monday morning. Charles Boyd had handled real estate and general practice law out of an office on Main Street in Hendersonville for close to 30 years, had done our will and Doris's estate work, and had the one quality I've always respected most in a professional, which is that he tells you the truth even when the manageable version would be easier to hear. I sat across from him and I laid it out for him the way I used to lay out a machine failure for a plant manager. Dated, factual, No editorializing, because the facts didn't need editorializing to be plenty. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which not every lawyer will do. When I finished, he said, "Harold, what do you want to happen?" I said I wanted Robert and Jennifer out of my house by the end of the year, and I wanted it done in a way that followed Tennessee law to the letter, documented well enough that if either of them decided to make it difficult, there'd be no ambiguity about who'd done what and when. He told me that under Tennessee law, since they'd never signed a lease and paid no rent, they were tenants at will, technically entitled to 30 days' notice, though he recommended we go with a full 60 for the paper trail and to head off any argument that the notice was unreasonable. I told him 60 was fine. He said he'd have the notice to vacate drafted inside a week and we'd send it certified so there'd be a delivery record either way, signed or unsigned. Then he asked me if I was sure I wanted to go this route before I tried talking to Robert man-to-man first. I told him a conversation with my son about my house and his future in it would turn into a conversation about his and Jennifer's opinions of my house and my future in it, and that I'd already had that conversation for a year and a half without either of them saying a word out loud, and I knew exactly how it would go if we said the words out loud too. He said, "All right then, let's do this correctly." The notice went out certified the following Thursday. Certified mail, if you've never dealt with it, either gets signed for at the door or it leaves a slip and sits at the local post office until claimed, or in our case, since I have a locking mailbox out at the road, the carrier leaves a notice card in the box itself, telling you a certified piece is waiting for pickup at the post office in town. That notice card sat in my mailbox from Wednesday afternoon, which I know because I collected the mail myself that day and saw it and put it right back where it was, unclaimed, same as I found it. Jennifer handed me her index card of household expectations the following Thursday evening. I sent her out to that mailbox. She came back in holding the pickup notice with an expression that moved through about 4 different stages in the space of 10 seconds. Confusion first, then something closer to disbelief, and then a stillness that I recognized because I'd seen something like it on the floor of the plant once, on a man's face, right after he realized the part he'd just signed off on had failed inspection 3 stations down the line and there was no taking it back now. She set the card down on the table across from mine. She said, "Harold, what is this?" I told her it was a notice that certified mail was waiting for her at the post office, and that the letter itself was from my attorney, and that it was a notice to vacate the property within 60 days. She said I couldn't do that. Then she stopped herself, because she already knew I could. She just hadn't expected to be handed the proof of it in her own hand, 10 seconds after handing me her own list of rules. She said, "Robert doesn't know about this." I said Robert would know as soon as she told him. She said, "This is because of the card, isn't it?" I said, "Jennifer, I've been watching what's gone on in this house for a year and a half. I started writing it down back in October. I called Charles Boyd 5 weeks ago, right after I found Robert in my den going through the deed and Doris's estate papers with his phone out. The notice went in that mailbox yesterday afternoon. You handed me your list tonight. Your list didn't cause any of this. Your list just told me tonight was the night to send you to go get it." She looked at the notice again. She looked at her own index card sitting there next to it. And something happened on her face that I hadn't seen in the 7 years I'd known her, which was the look of a person who manages every situation she's ever in, hitting a situation that wasn't going to be managed, only survived or not survived. She asked what happened if they didn't leave in 60 days. I told her Charles Boyd would file for a formal detainer action with the county, and the sheriff's department would carry out the removal, and that it would all be public record, and that I'd rather never get there but that I would if I had to, and I wanted her to know clearly that I meant it. She sat down at the table. She didn't say anything else for a long minute. Then she got up and went upstairs, and I heard her voice through the ceiling, low and fast, on the phone. Robert got home around 6:30. I was out at the garden along the east fence, working the soil for the fall, planting the way Doris's notebook said to do it in October, turning it over before the first hard frost. I heard his truck in the driveway, and I heard the kind of quiet come over the house afterward that only happens when a conversation's been going on inside, and it stops dead the second somebody new walks in. He came out to the garden about 10 minutes later, and he was holding the certified mail notice in his hand, which meant Jennifer had shown it to him the second his boots hit the kitchen floor. He stood at the edge of the tilled row and said, "Dad." I set my hoe down and turned around and looked at my son standing there with that slip of paper in his hand and an expression on his face like a man walking into a meeting he already knows he's going to lose. He asked if I'd really talked to a lawyer. I told him I had, 5 weeks back. He said I hadn't told him. I said I didn't have a reason to tell him until his wife handed me a list of house rules that same evening. He said, so the card set it off. I told him the card didn't set anything off, it just told me the timing was right. He asked what he'd done to deserve this, and I said, Robert, you were in my den in September with my desk drawer open and your phone out, taking a picture of your mother's estate paperwork and my deed and my mortgage records. That's what you did. His face changed then in a way that confirmed something I'd suspected but hadn't been able to prove for certain, which is that the September afternoon had been on purpose and not an accident, because a man who stumbles into something by accident apologizes too much and explains too much, and Robert had done neither. He'd performed calm, and the performance had worked in the moment, but standing in that garden with the notice in his hand, the performance had run out of road. He didn't say anything for a while. The garden was doing what a Tennessee garden does in early October, the tomato vines starting to give up, the first cool evening air coming in off the field behind the fence line. He finally said, "We can't be out in 60 days. I told him he could, that he and Jennifer both worked, and finding a place to live in 60 days was a solvable problem for two grown people with incomes, and what wasn't solvable, what wasn't up for discussion at all, was them continuing to stay in this house. I told him I wasn't saying it out of anger, and he asked why not, and it was the most honest question he'd asked me all evening. I told him anger would mean I'd been caught off guard, and I hadn't been, not for a year and a half, not since I started writing things down in October of the year before, not since I sat in Charles Boyd's office and told him what I wanted done. I told him this wasn't anger. This was a decision, made the way I used to make decisions on the floor of that plant, based on what actually happened, not on how I felt about what happened. He asked if I'd really been keeping notes. I told him 30-some pages, dated, going back a year. He sat down hard on the wooden bench Doris had put out there in 2011. The one she said a garden needed so a person had somewhere to sit and study what they'd grown instead of just working it and walking away. He sat there with that certified mail notice folded in both hands and looked out at the rows. He said, "Mom would have talked to me first." I told him his mother would have seen this coming faster than I did, and she probably would have sat him down back in 2022, and it might have gone different if she had, because she was quicker on people than I've ever been. I told him I wasn't her, I was slower on that kind of thing, but I got there eventually. He looked at the dahlias along the fence, past their bloom now, going brown and dropping seed the way Doris's notebook said they would by this time of year. He asked if I was still following her notebook for all of it. I told him every row, every season, since the week she died. He sat a while longer, and then he stood up, and he went back inside the house. They were gone inside of 51 days, not the full 60. They took what belonged to them and left what was mine, including, I noticed without saying a word about it, the coffee maker, which had drifted back over to the far counter sometime in that final week, and which I moved back the day after they left, same as I'd done the first time. Except this time there was nobody left in the house to move it back again. Denise drove up from Knoxville the weekend after. She came in Friday evening with 2 bags of groceries and a kind of loose, easy relief in her that I hadn't seen in her in a couple of years, the relief of somebody who'd been watching something from a distance for a long time and had just gotten to watch it come out right. She walked into that living room Saturday morning, the one arranged exactly the way her mother had left it in 2018, and she stood there a second and said, "It looks like Mom's house again." I told her it had looked like her mother's house the whole time. They'd just crowded it up with their own things on top of it. She asked if I'd cleared all that out myself, and I told her I had. We spent Saturday afternoon out at the garden, the two of us, turning the fall soil the way the notebook said to, and Denise read me the entries out loud while I did the digging, and it took us the better part of 3 hours. And at the end of it, the rows looked exactly the way Doris's October pages said they ought to look. Denise sat back on her heels at the end of the last row and looked out over what we'd done and said her mother would have been proud of that bed. I told her Doris always knew exactly what she was doing out there, every single year. Denise asked me if I'd known, that morning with the card, what was already sitting in that mailbox. I told her I'd known the whole day before, that the notice card had come Wednesday, and I'd seen it and left it right where it was, waiting, and that I'd been waiting on Jennifer to hand me the right moment to send her out there, and Jennifer, being exactly who she is, was always eventually going to hand me something. Denise looked at the garden a long minute and then she said, "Dad, that is the most you thing I have ever heard in my whole life." I told her that her mother would have handled it faster and probably would have had it wrapped up 2 years earlier. Denise said her mother would have had it done in 2022, and I said I know I'm slow on the people part of things, but I get there. She laughed, and it was her mother's laugh exactly, the same rise at the end of it, and I let that sit out there in the garden with us a minute before either of us said another word. This house on Comstock Road is mine. It's been mine for 46 years, and it'll stay mine for whatever years I've got left in me. And when I'm done with it, it goes to my 3 children. Split even. All of it spelled out clean and legal the way Charles Boyd helped me update it 2 years back. The deed's in the bottom drawer of that desk. So is the mortgage paperwork, and Doris's estate file, right where it's always been. And nobody's putting a phone camera over any of it again as long as I'm alive to stop them. The garden along the east fence is coming in exactly the way her notebook says it should for this time of year. The coffee maker's sitting on the counter where she wanted it 40 years ago, and where it's going to stay. That's the house I built with my own 2 hands, and it's the house I held on to, and I didn't do it loud, and I didn't do it with a single raised voice at that kitchen table. I did it with a certified letter, and a straight sentence, and a mailbox that already had my answer sitting in it before that index card ever hit the table. If this one got to you, tell me in the comments which part hit hardest, because I read every single one of them. Hit that like button for me, and if you're not subscribed yet, go on and take care of that, because we're back here next week with another one. True stories, every week, so make sure that bell's turned on, because you're not going to want to miss what's coming.